I did not realize I was disappearing at first. That is the part nobody warns you about. Nobody tells you that a life can still look completely intact while something essential inside you is quietly being dismantled. You can still be the woman who remembers the dentist appointment, the birthday card, the login password, the parent-teacher conference, the refill at the pharmacy, the polite smile in the grocery store. You can still answer emails with perfect punctuation. You can still host Thanksgiving. You can still be called dependable, capable, strong. And yet somewhere beneath all of that, something can begin to go missing. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Not in a way that gives the world a clean story. Just slowly enough that even you start to wonder whether you are imagining it. This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. I want to begin there because that sentence is not soft. It is devastatingly precise. It names a kind of pain that does not usually get center stage. It is not the pain of public collapse. It is not the pain of obvious ruin. It is the pain of a woman who is still functioning so well that almost nobody thinks to ask whether she is all right. It is the pain of waking up in a beautiful home, or a decent home, or simply the life you worked hard to build, and feeling something unsettled moving under your skin. It is the pain of hearing your own voice in conversations and somehow not recognizing it anymore. It is the pain of carrying a full, respectable adult life while privately wondering why you feel smaller than you used to. And sometimes the most frightening part is this: there may be no scene you can point to. No single spectacular betrayal. No one moment dramatic enough to justify how strange you feel. Just a growing sense that certain conversations leave you foggy. Certain reactions leave you ashamed. Certain silences feel heavier than they should. You leave ordinary moments with the unsettling sensation that you have somehow become less real in your own life. That is the doorway into this conversation. Before I go any further, if this kind of truth speaks to you, subscribe to the channel. That support matters more than people think. It helps me keep making these kinds of videos, the kind that do not flatter pain, do not rush it, and do not insult your intelligence with easy answers. There was a time when the word narcissist felt like a revelation. For a lot of women, it was not trendy. It was not gossip. It was not a weapon. It was a gasp of recognition. It was the first time years of confusion suddenly had a shape. It was the first time some women were able to say, "This is not just a difficult relationship. This is not just me being too sensitive. This is not just one more thing I should learn to tolerate." A word entered the room, and with it came relief. Because sometimes the most liberating thing in the world is not advice. It is language. Language that finally tells the truth about what your body has known for a very long time. I understand that kind of relief. I understand what it means when pain finally has a name. But I also think something dangerous has happened. The word that once helped people breathe is now being thrown around so casually that it is starting to lose the very precision that made it powerful. And when a word like that loses precision, real people pay the price. Suddenly every bad boyfriend is a narcissist. Every selfish husband is a narcissist. Every ex-wife is a narcissist. Every difficult parent, every disappointing friend, every emotionally immature man, every woman who lacks empathy on a bad day, every person who hurts us in a way we do not yet know how to process, they all get pulled under one giant label. And the problem with that is not just that it is sloppy. The problem is that it makes reality harder to see. Because if I call every painful relationship narcissistic, I may miss the truth of what is actually happening. I may misread immaturity as pathology. I may turn a wounded but reparable relationship into something colder than it needs to be. I may reach for language that closes the door before I have really understood the room. But the opposite is just as dangerous, maybe more. If I live inside a truly destructive pattern and fail to name it because the internet has turned the word into a joke, a trend, or an overused accusation, then I may stay far too long in something that is quietly reshaping me from the inside. That is the cost of confusion. And women in midlife know something about the cost of confusion. By the time a woman is 35, 45, 58, she has usually lived enough life to know that not every wound looks the way the movies told her it would. She knows that some of the loneliest marriages are the ones that look most respectable from the outside. She knows that a man can be admired in public and deeply unsettling in private. She knows that a woman can hold a family together while privately feeling like she is vanishing inside the very life she built. She knows that sometimes what breaks you is not one catastrophic event, but the repetition of something so subtle, so constant, and so emotionally disorienting that you eventually stop trusting your own interpretation of what is happening. That is why this conversation matters so much. Not because I want to hand you one more internet diagnosis. Not because I want to make you suspicious of every flawed person in your life. And not because I think adult relationships can be reduced to tidy little categories. I care about this because I think many women are suffering inside realities that are much harder to describe than the culture allows. We have plenty of language for dramatic endings. We have plenty of language for obvious betrayal. What we do not have enough of is language for slow erosion. For what it feels like to be spoken over so consistently that you start editing your own thoughts before they leave your mouth. For what it feels like to explain your pain and somehow leave the conversation apologizing for having feelings. For what it feels like to live with a person who looks perfectly decent to the world and yet leaves you carrying a private heaviness you cannot quite explain. There is a special kind of anguish in pain that has no obvious bruise. And there is a special kind of loneliness in being a woman who is still performing competence while privately trying to figure out whether what she feels is even real. I think that is part of why the word narcissism hit so hard when it first entered the mainstream. It gave form to something many women had felt for years but had never been given permission to name. It told them that emotional confusion was not always a personal failing. That exhaustion was not always oversensitivity. That self-doubt could sometimes be a consequence of what they were living inside, not proof that they were defective. But once a powerful word gets pulled into the machinery of the internet, something changes. The internet does not reward nuance. It rewards speed, certainty, moral performance. A clean villain. A clean script. A quick answer. It does not like complexity, even though complexity is where most real lives are actually lived. So the word gets flattened. Stripped of depth. Passed around without weight. And before long, something sacred becomes common in the worst way. That is what I want to resist here. I do not want louder judgment. I want deeper discernment. I do not want to turn women into detectives of every tiny flaw. I want to help them become more faithful to what their inner life has been trying to tell them. I do not want to teach women how to accuse faster. I want to help them see more clearly. Because the truth is, some relationships are difficult. Some are painful. Some are immature. Some are mismatched. Some are strained by old wounds, bad habits, poor communication, depression, grief, alcohol, fear, or years of emotional neglect. And then there are relationships where something more patterned, more chronic, more destabilizing is happening, something that slowly teaches one person that her reality is always less valid than the other person's comfort. Those are not the same thing. And if we lose the ability to tell the difference, women will continue to suffer in two directions at once. Some will label too quickly and miss the chance to understand what is actually happening. Others will minimize too long and lose years of their lives trying to survive in a climate that keeps thinning out their sense of self. So this is where I want to begin. Not with a checklist. Not with a slogan. Not with a villain. But with a woman. A woman who still gets things done. A woman who still looks functional. A woman who may even look successful. And yet inside, she feels something she cannot quite explain. Not broken. Not dramatic. Just deeply, quietly off. If that woman is you, I want you to stay with me. Because the story I want to tell is not really about a word. It is about what happens when pain finally gets language. And what happens when that language starts getting misused. And most of all, it is about the difference between a hard relationship and a dangerous one, a difference that may determine whether a woman spends the next 10 years recovering her life, or apologizing herself deeper into its disappearance. Two men, one label, and the trap most people fall into. If I want to understand how easily people get this conversation wrong, I do not start with theory. I start with two men. The first one is Ethan. Ethan is the kind of man people tend to forgive before they should. He is easy to like in the beginning because he is easy to feel around. He is warm, social, animated, the kind of person who fills space without seeming to try. He remembers your friend's dog's name. He helps carry folding chairs into the yard before anyone asks. He can make a tired room feel alive again. If there is a barbecue, he is standing by the grill. If there is a game on, he is halfway to turning strangers into friends. He is not polished, not especially introspective, not always emotionally disciplined, but he feels alive in a way that many people mistake for goodness. And maybe some of it is goodness. That is what makes these things hard. Ethan is not cruel in the cold, clinical sense. He is not a man who sits around plotting how to undermine someone he loves. He is more boyish than sinister, more impulsive than calculating. He likes his friends too much. He drinks too much when he is in the wrong crowd. He confuses being fun with being free. He can be inattentive in the way that emotionally underdeveloped people often are, present, affectionate, even devoted in some moments, and then strangely careless in others, as though love should excuse a lack of depth. Then one weekend he goes to Nashville with a group of friends. He drinks too much. He gets carried away. He has a one-night stand. There is no graceful way to describe that. It is ugly because betrayal is ugly. It is painful because broken trust is painful. I do not believe in softening that kind of wound just because the person who caused it is likable. A woman's heartbreak does not become less serious because the man who caused it has charm. But what matters next is what Ethan does when the thing he has done can no longer be hidden from himself. He does not deny it. He does not wait to be exposed. He does not build a story in which his girlfriend somehow forced his hand by being difficult, distant, or too demanding. He comes home carrying the full weight of what he has done. He confesses badly, because there is no elegant version of that confession, but he confesses. He is ashamed. He knows he has caused pain. He does not perform remorse to end the conversation quickly. He actually feels it. He knows he has crossed a line that says something painful about him, and he does not immediately turn that pain into an attack on the woman he hurt. He may still be immature. He may still have parts of himself that need growing up. He may still lose the relationship, and she may still decide that the rupture is too severe to survive. That would be her right. But Ethan, for all his failure, still reveals something important: he is capable of contact with another person's pain. He is capable of shame that does not instantly mutate into blame. He is capable of recognizing that what he did matters because it happened to someone else, not just because it now complicates his own life. Then there is Daniel. Daniel is harder to explain because men like Daniel are often harder to indict. On paper, Daniel can look like the safer choice by a mile. He lives in a polished suburb outside Boston where things appear orderly from the street. He is responsible. He is punctual. He keeps up with obligations. He pays bills on time. He shovels snow from an elderly neighbor's walkway before anyone asks. He is the kind of man who remembers school pickup times, fills the gas tank, and knows how to appear solid in all the places the world tends to reward. If Ethan is messy, Daniel is composed. If Ethan is overgrown, Daniel is contained. If Ethan makes people nervous because he seems too loose, Daniel makes them feel reassured because he seems so in control. That is precisely why women can stay lost for years beside a man like Daniel. Because Daniel does not need obvious chaos to do damage. He does not need a dramatic scandal. He does not even need to break the rules in ways other people can easily see. What he does instead is subtler, and for that reason far more difficult to explain to anyone who is not living with him. His partner brings him hurt, and he turns it into a problem with her tone. She tries to tell him that something he said at dinner left her embarrassed, and within minutes the conversation is no longer about what happened. It is about how she always chooses the worst possible moment. How she reads into everything. How she creates tension where none existed until she arrived with her feelings. She leaves the exchange not only unheard, but vaguely ashamed that she spoke at all. This happens once, then twice, then 100 times. When Daniel forgets, dismisses, belittles, withholds, or shifts blame, he rarely does it in a way dramatic enough to make the outside world gasp. That is part of why the wound becomes so lonely. He can still look honorable to everyone else because his damage is relational, not theatrical. It happens in tone. In timing. In the exhausted little laugh that tells a woman her pain is tiresome. In the way he makes every emotional reckoning feel like an unfair burden placed on a man who already does so much. In the way he can talk about himself as though he is the one carrying the family, the one who is misunderstood, the one who deserves more patience, more understanding, more room. And because he is competent, because he is reliable in public, because he knows how to meet visible responsibilities, many women who live with a Daniel-type man begin to suspect that the problem must be something less tangible and therefore less legitimate. They think, he's a good father. He works hard. He is respected. He does not humiliate me in front of people. He has never done anything unforgivable in the obvious sense. So why do I feel so alone when I am sitting right next to him? That question matters. Because this is the trap most people fall into, they confuse visible misconduct with deeper relational danger. They assume the loudest man is the one to fear. They assume the man who breaks the rule in public is more dangerous than the man who quietly rewrites reality in private. They assume betrayal must look like one catastrophic event when in many lives it looks like years of chronic emotional invalidation. If I place Ethan and Daniel side by side, most people will still instinctively choose Ethan as the narcissist. The answer feels obvious to them. Ethan is larger, looser, more repetitive. He takes up social space. He gets drunk. He cheats. There is something almost embarrassingly easy about placing him in the category of selfish male harm. Daniel, by contrast, looks civilized. He looks trustworthy. He looks like the man your family would tell you not to let go of. And that is how women get trapped inside the wrong story. Because the public eye is drawn to spectacle, but the private soul is often altered by repetition. One man may wound you in a terrible act. Another may wear away your confidence, your clarity, and your sense of reality in slow increments so small that you cannot even describe the injury without sounding uncertain. That does not mean one-night betrayal is trivial. It is not. It can shatter trust, dignity, sexual safety, and the emotional foundation of a relationship. But a terrible act and a destructive relational pattern are not the same thing. They may overlap. Sometimes they do. But they are not automatically identical. The real question is not simply, who hurt me? The real question is, what happens when my pain enters the room? Does this person meet it with accountability, even if imperfectly? Does he understand that love requires repair? Does he grasp that another person's hurt is real even when it is inconvenient? Or does he instinctively protect himself at all costs, even if that means turning your confusion into your fault? That is where the distinction begins to sharpen. A man like Ethan may fail you in a devastating way and still possess the human capacity to feel remorse, to take responsibility, to change, to understand that trust is not owed once it has been broken. A man like Daniel may never give the world a scandal and still create a private climate in which the woman beside him slowly stops trusting her own mind. I think that is why this conversation has become so distorted. People want easy categories. They want a villain they can identify at a glance. But emotional reality is rarely that cooperative. Sometimes the more dangerous person is the one nobody suspects because his harm does not look unruly. It looks reasonable. It looks disciplined. It looks like the kind of life a woman should be grateful for. And yet gratitude cannot survive for long in a place where reality is always being edited to preserve one person's comfort. If I am serious about understanding narcissism, or even just chronic emotional harm, I have to stop asking who looks worst from a distance. I have to ask a more intimate and more difficult question. Who leaves the other person smaller over time? Who makes honesty feel dangerous? Who can bear the weight of accountability, and who must always hand it back? That is where the truth starts becoming visible. And it is also where many women, for the first time, begin to realize that the relationship that looked most respectable from the outside may have been the one quietly undoing them all along. How the internet turned a lifeline into a weapon. There is something the internet does exceptionally well, and almost none of it has to do with wisdom. It can take a human experience that was once private, tender, and difficult to name, and turn it into a public script before people have even had time to understand what they are holding. It can take language that once belonged to survivors, therapists, and people moving carefully through pain, and flatten it into something fast, clickable, and morally satisfying. And once that happens, the word may still sound the same, but it no longer does the same work. That is what I believe has happened to the word narcissism. I understand why it spread. I understand why women reached for it. When a person has spent years feeling confused in a relationship, any language that offers pattern instead of chaos can feel life-saving. There is enormous relief in finally hearing something that makes the room stop spinning. For a long time, many people lived inside emotionally destabilizing relationships without having a phrase for what was happening. They knew they felt erased. They knew certain conversations left them feeling strange, ashamed, and somehow less solid. They knew they were always recovering from interactions that looked normal from the outside. But they did not have a framework. Then one day, a word arrived that seemed to connect the dots. That kind of recognition is powerful. It is not shallow. It is not trendy. It can be the first moment a woman realizes she is not simply failing at love. She is not weak because she feels confused. She is not broken because her body tenses before certain conversations. She is not irrational because she keeps feeling that something is off even when life looks stable from the outside. Language can do that. It can put a railing around an experience that once felt like a cliff. But the internet does not know how to leave sacred things alone. It does not know how to let a word remain careful. It takes what is useful and turns it into content. It takes what is nuanced and turns it into certainty. It takes what should be explored slowly and turns it into something people consume in bursts between errands, in bed at midnight, in a parked car, in the glow of a screen while the rest of the house is asleep. And when pain becomes content, the rules change. The goal is no longer truth. The goal becomes recognition at speed. That is where things start to go wrong. Because pain is always looking for shape. When I am hurting, I do not just want comfort. I want explanation. I want the thing I am feeling to make sense. I want a frame strong enough to hold what I have been carrying. And if a video appears that says, if he does these 5 things, he is a narcissist, there is a part of me that wants to believe it immediately, not because I am foolish, but because confusion is exhausting. Certainty feels like rest when you have been mentally overworking for years. The internet understands that hunger better than most people realize. It knows that what keeps someone watching is not complexity. It is emotional precision without intellectual precision. It is the sentence that lands in the body before the mind has time to question it. It is the thrilling terror of hearing a stranger describe your relationship with just enough accuracy to make you feel seen and just enough simplification to keep you hooked. That is how a lifeline becomes a weapon. At first, the word narcissism was helping people identify patterns they had not been taught to see. Then it started being used to explain almost everything painful. Every selfish act. Every cold ex. Every partner who disappoints. Every argument that leaves a bruise on the ego. Every parent who lacked warmth. Every person who could not meet someone's emotional needs. The word expanded so quickly that it stopped functioning like a careful description and started functioning like a verdict. And verdicts are seductive. A verdict does not ask me to stay in uncertainty. It does not ask me to sort through grief, my own blind spots, the limits of the other person, the structure of the relationship, the injuries each of us brought into it, the possibility of incompatibility, the possibility of manipulation, the possibility of both. A verdict offers a cleaner emotional transaction. It says, this is what it is, this is who they are, and now you know. I do not say this with contempt. I say it with sorrow. Because I think many women have gone online looking for reality and instead found a kind of emotional theater that only resembles reality from a distance. They find short videos that reward them with instant clarity, but that clarity is often too compressed to be trustworthy. It has no room for pattern over time. No room for proportion. No room for the difference between a painful trait and a personality structure. No room for the possibility that someone can be selfish without being narcissistic, immature without being predatory, disappointing without being psychologically dangerous. And no room either for the harder truth that a person can be outwardly decent and still be deeply harmful in intimate life. That is one of the cruelest side effects of internet psychology. It does not merely produce false certainty. It also trains people to look for the wrong things. If the online version of narcissism is all arrogance, grand gestures, obvious manipulation, and cartoon-level cruelty, then many women living inside quieter forms of emotional harm will miss what is happening altogether. They will think, well, he is not flashy. He is not grandiose in that way. He does not act like the men in the videos. Meanwhile, they are still being destabilized, still being invalidated, still shrinking in invisible ways, but because the aesthetic does not match, they keep minimizing it. So now the internet has done two forms of damage at once. It has overextended the label so that people use it too quickly, and it has stylized the pattern so dramatically that others fail to recognize it where it actually exists. That is the trap. The algorithm does not care whether a woman learns the difference. It only cares whether she stays engaged. And what keeps people engaged is not a mature conversation about psychological structure. It is moral adrenaline. It is outrage. It is being told that your ex was exactly this, your mother is exactly that, your boss is exactly this, and here are the 7 signs you missed. The content works because it does something emotionally immediate, it rescues people from ambiguity. But ambiguity, however painful, is often where truth lives. Especially in adult relationships. Especially for women in the middle years of life, when relationships are layered with history, children, money, aging, old trauma, family loyalty, fatigue, illness, social appearance, obligation, and the long momentum of years. By this stage, very few women are dealing with feelings in laboratory conditions. They are trying to make sense of relational pain while also running households, holding jobs, caring for parents, managing their own health, and trying not to fall apart in front of people who still need things from them. In that state, a simple explanation feels merciful. But simple explanations can become emotional narcotics. They soothe immediately, then distort gradually. I think the women I feel most protective of are not the ones casually diagnosing everyone in their lives. It is the women sitting alone after midnight, searching because they are desperate to know whether what they are feeling is real. They are not hungry for drama. They are hungry for orientation. They want to know whether they are overreacting, whether they are naming something true, whether the ache in their body has a pattern, or whether they are just tired, hormonal, difficult, impossible to satisfy, too sensitive, too intense, too much. They are looking for relief from self-doubt. And the internet, at its worst, offers them recognition without responsibility. It says, yes, that sounds familiar, but it does not ask the deeper questions. What is the long-term pattern? What happens when you bring hurt into the room? Is there empathy? Is there repair? Is there accountability? What happens to your nervous system around this person? Are you becoming clearer or more scrambled over time? The internet prefers shorter questions because shorter questions create faster answers. But real discernment is almost never fast. That is why I have become wary of therapy language in public spaces when it is delivered without humility. Words like trauma, gaslighting, narcissism, boundaries, attachment, regulation, these words matter. They can illuminate a life. But once they are stripped of context and passed around like certainty, they stop helping people think and start helping people conclude. There is a difference. Thinking is slower. More painful. Less flattering. It requires me to tolerate not knowing for a while. It requires me to look carefully, not just reactively. It requires me to separate the part of me that wants immediate emotional rescue from the part of me that is mature enough to stay close to complexity. Concluding is easier. Concluding gives me the relief of a final answer. But emotional relief is not always the same thing as truth. I think the only way to resist this is to become more careful than the culture around us. To let language help us, but not hypnotize us. To let recognition open inquiry rather than end it. To stop asking whether a word feels satisfying and start asking whether it actually helps us see. Because once a woman has spent too long in confusion, she does not need louder labels. She needs more faithful perception. And that is something the internet, for all its noise, still cannot give her unless she learns how to protect her own mind while she is using it. What narcissism actually is, and what it isn't. I think one of the most dangerous things happening in this conversation is that people are using the word narcissism as if it simply means, a person who hurt me badly. I understand the impulse. Pain wants a shape. Pain wants a name. Pain wants a face to hold responsible for the ruin it leaves behind. But if I am going to use a word this serious, I have to respect it enough to define it carefully. Otherwise I am not clarifying anything. I am just throwing fire into a room that is already hard to see inside. So when I ask what narcissism actually is, I am not asking for a trendy summary or a list built for an algorithm. I am asking for a more mature truth. The kind of truth that can hold complexity without dissolving into vagueness. To me, narcissism is not simply a bad personality. It is not a rude man. It is not a selfish woman. It is not a disappointing husband, a vain friend, a controlling mother, or an ex who failed me in the worst possible way. Those people may exist. They may do real damage. But narcissism, in the way it truly matters, is something more patterned than ordinary selfishness and more enduring than a season of emotional immaturity. It is a personality style organized around the protection of a fragile self at the expense of genuine mutuality. That is the clearest way I know to say it. There is usually a visible layer and a hidden one. The visible layer is what people tend to notice first: entitlement, self-importance, hypersensitivity to criticism, a need to be seen as special, superior, exceptional, misunderstood, uniquely burdened, or deserving of different rules than everyone else. Sometimes that layer is loud and unmistakable. Sometimes it is polished, subtle, and socially rewarded. Sometimes it looks like confidence. Sometimes it looks like charisma. Sometimes it looks like moral certainty. Sometimes it even looks like victimhood. But the hidden layer is what gives the visible layer its force. Underneath all that self-protection, there is often profound fragility. Shame. Instability. A deep inability to tolerate being ordinary, wrong, limited, disappointing, or emotionally accountable without feeling psychologically threatened. And because that inner structure is so brittle, the narcissistic person spends enormous energy protecting it. That protection is where the relational damage begins. A lot of people think narcissism is mainly about loving yourself too much. I do not think that is quite right. If anything, it often looks more like being unable to survive certain feelings about yourself, so you build a whole way of relating that keeps those feelings at bay. You need admiration because the silence is unbearable. You need control because uncertainty feels humiliating. You need to be the injured one because responsibility feels annihilating. You need to win the emotional narrative because losing it would crack open something inside you that you have spent a lifetime defending against. That is why narcissism is not the same thing as confidence. Real confidence has room in it. It can tolerate another person's light. It can apologize without collapsing. It can be wrong without turning the room hostile. It does not need to shrink someone else in order to remain intact. Narcissism is different. It may look powerful, but the power is rigid. It cannot breathe around other people's reality for very long. It keeps bending the emotional field back toward itself. That bending shows up in certain predictable ways. Empathy is one of the most important. I do not mean that every narcissistic person is completely devoid of empathy in the absolute sense. That would be too simple. Some can sound empathic. Some can perform empathy convincingly, especially when being seen as caring serves their image. Some can understand, on an intellectual level, what someone else is feeling. But there is often a profound limit to how deeply another person's experience can matter when it conflicts with the narcissistic person's need to preserve themselves. That is the difference I think many women feel before they can explain it. They are not merely uncared for. They are emotionally overridden. Their pain becomes tolerable only when it does not inconvenience the other person's self-image. Then there is entitlement, which is much more than wanting things. Everybody wants things. Everybody gets frustrated. Everybody has moments of self-centeredness. Entitlement, in this deeper sense, is the persistent assumption that one's needs, moods, time, perspective, and comfort should carry more weight than other people's. It is the invisible hierarchy inside the relationship. My stress excuses me. My burdens matter more. My irritation justifies my tone. My disappointment takes precedence over your wound. My version of events wins. That hierarchy does not always announce itself openly. Sometimes it is wrapped in competence, sacrifice, or moral superiority. Sometimes the narcissistic person appears to be doing so much for everyone else, and that becomes part of the emotional leverage. The message is not always spoken, but it is felt. After all I do, how dare you question me? Another core piece is low empathy joined with self-centeredness, and together they produce a very specific relational climate. In that climate, other people are not experienced as fully separate subjects with equal emotional reality. They are experienced more as extensions, functions, mirrors, threats, admirers, disappointments, or obstacles. That does not mean the narcissistic person consciously thinks, you are just an object. It means that in practice, mutuality breaks down. The other person exists, but not with equal solidity. That is why so many partners of narcissistic people say some version of the same thing. I felt like I only existed correctly when I was making life easier for them. There is also the need for admiration, and I think people often misunderstand this as simple attention seeking. Sometimes it is that. But often it is deeper than attention. It is the need to be continually reinforced from the outside because the inside is too unstable to carry its own weight. Praise, deference, validation, special treatment, being the center of concern, being viewed as noble, gifted, wronged, indispensable, these become emotional fuel. And when the supply weakens, irritation, withdrawal, contempt, blame, or rage often follow. This is where emotional regulation becomes so important. A narcissistic person often cannot metabolize disappointment the way a more grounded person can. Criticism does not feel like criticism. It feels like exposure. Limits do not feel like limits. They feel like disrespect. Another person's pain does not feel like information. It feels like accusation. And because these experiences are so threatening, the reaction is often disproportionate. Not always through shouting. Sometimes through sulking, icy silence, moral reversal, passive aggression, emotional punishment, or making the other person regret bringing anything up at all. That, to me, is one of the clearest signs that something more serious may be happening. The relationship stops being a place where reality can be discussed safely. And this is also where I have to say what narcissism is not. It is not forgetting an anniversary. It is not being emotionally awkward. It is not shutting down under stress one time, or even many times, if there is still real accountability and movement. It is not ordinary vanity, ordinary insecurity, ordinary selfishness, or ordinary human mess. It is not every person who struggles with intimacy. It is not every man who is badly parented. It is not every woman who has learned to control because control once made her feel safe. Some people are simply immature. Some are traumatized. Some are selfish. Some are incompatible with us. Some are unwell in ways that have nothing to do with narcissism. Some are careless, stunted, frightened, avoidant, depressed, rigid, or emotionally underdeveloped. They may still hurt us terribly. But not every source of harm is narcissism. That distinction matters because once I start calling every painful trait narcissistic, I lose the ability to identify the actual pattern. I start confusing intensity with structure. I stop asking whether this person can reflect, repair, change, tolerate discomfort, and remain in contact with another person's experience. I stop asking whether there is flexibility anywhere in the system. Because that is another thing about narcissism, it is rigid. A healthier personality, even an imperfect one, still has some flexibility. It can bend. It can learn. It can feel remorse without turning that remorse into self-protective attack. It can admit, at least sometimes, that the other person's experience is real even when it is hard to hear. Narcissism tends to be far more defended than that. It doubles down. It rewrites. It protects itself first. I think that is why people who have lived with narcissistic patterns often emerge not simply heartbroken, but disoriented. They were not just disappointed. They were involved in a relational system where truth itself was unstable unless it served one person's emotional survival. So when I say narcissism, I do not mean a person with flaws. I mean a deeper style of being in which fragility gets defended through entitlement, empathy is too limited to sustain true mutuality, and the relationship gradually organizes itself around protecting one person from shame while the other person pays the cost. That is why the word matters. And that is also why it must never be used casually. The quiet violence of invalidation. What breaks a person is not always what outsiders would call abuse. Sometimes it is not the slammed door, not the affair, not the public humiliation, not the kind of story that makes people inhale sharply and say, "You should have left immediately." Sometimes what breaks a person is much quieter than that. So quiet, in fact, that she cannot even prove to herself that anything serious is happening. She only knows that she keeps walking away from ordinary conversations feeling altered. Smaller. Ashamed. Unsteady in ways she cannot explain without sounding dramatic even to her own ears. That is the quiet violence of invalidation. I think the reason this kind of pain is so difficult to name is because it rarely arrives dressed like violence. It arrives as correction. As irritation. As a sigh. As a laugh that is just dismissive enough to make you feel foolish for having said anything. It arrives as someone telling you that you are misreading the moment, exaggerating the problem, making the atmosphere heavy, taking things too personally, being too emotional, too suspicious, too difficult, too much. And if that happens once, maybe it is a bad day. If it happens 10 times, maybe it feels like tension. If it happens for years, it begins to alter your relationship with your own mind. That is what I mean when I say quiet violence. I do not mean softness. I mean damage that happens without spectacle. A lot of women know this damage intimately. They know what it is to feel hurt, gather themselves, try to bring that hurt into language, and then watch the conversation slip out of their hands. They know what it is to start with a feeling and somehow end up defending their personality. They know what it is to say, "That upset me," and be met not with curiosity but with annoyance, contempt, exhaustion, or some subtle signal that what they have just done is deeply inconvenient. After enough repetitions, they stop expecting understanding. Then they stop expecting fairness. Then, more dangerously, they stop expecting that their experience can remain intact once it enters the room. That is when invalidation becomes internal. At first, the other person dismisses what I feel. Later, I begin to do it for them. I edit before I speak. I soften every sentence. I include disclaimers I do not mean. I say, "Maybe I'm overreacting," before I have even finished describing what happened. I begin to anticipate the rebuttal so thoroughly that I cannot access my own reaction without immediately putting it on trial. Eventually, I am not just afraid of conflict. I am afraid of my own perception. That is a devastating threshold to cross. Because when people talk about emotional harm, they often focus on the event. The betrayal. The cruel remark. The lie. The obvious offense. But chronic invalidation attacks something even more fundamental than trust in the other person. It attacks trust in the self. It teaches a woman, slowly and methodically, that her own mind is not a safe place to stand. That her instincts are unreliable. That her feelings are excessive. That her memories are distorted. That the more upset she is, the less credible she becomes. This is why the distinction between lying and gaslighting matters so much. A lie is painful. A lie distorts reality. But gaslighting does something more intimate and more invasive. It does not merely deny what happened. It recruits me into doubting my capacity to know what happened. It says, in effect, not only, "That's not true," but, "The fact that you think it is true says something troubling about you." That second move is where the deeper harm lives. I think many women miss this at first because gaslighting does not always sound dramatic. It can sound almost civilized. "You're remembering it wrong. That's not what I meant. I think you're projecting. You always do this when you're stressed. You hear what you want to hear. You're creating a problem where there wasn't one." Some of these phrases, in isolation, could appear in an ordinary disagreement. That is part of what makes the pattern so difficult to pin down. The damage is not always in the sentence itself. It is in the repetition. In the timing. In the cumulative effect of being steadily moved away from your own reality and toward theirs. And because this pattern often unfolds in relationships that look normal from the outside, the loneliness becomes profound. A woman may be living with someone respected, employed, stable, competent, even generous in visible ways. She may be married to the kind of man people describe as dependable. She may be married to a Daniel. And that can make the invalidation even harder to trust as serious, because nothing in the outer structure appears to justify the level of interior confusion she is carrying. She thinks, "He is responsible. He shows up. He provides. He is decent to other people. Why do I feel like I disappear every time I try to be honest?" That question matters more than most people realize. Because relationships are not only made of actions. They are made of atmosphere. Of emotional consequence. Of what becomes possible, and what becomes impossible, in the space between two people. And one of the most important questions I can ask about a relationship is this: what happens to my reality when it meets the other person's discomfort? If the answer is that my reality gets examined, mocked, minimized, or turned against me, then something serious is happening, even if no one outside the relationship would call it abuse. If I cannot bring hurt into the room without losing ownership of it, then the room is not safe in the way I need intimacy to be safe. I think this is one reason women often become exhausted in ways they do not fully understand. It is not only that they are hurt. It is that they are constantly performing translation. They are trying to make their experience acceptable enough to be heard. Trying to phrase things gently enough not to trigger dismissal. Trying to predict what wording will survive the conversation with the least distortion. Trying to stay calm enough to remain credible. Trying not to cry, because crying will make them look unstable. Trying not to sound too flat, because then they will be accused of being cold. The emotional labor becomes enormous. Not the labor of solving the relationship, but the labor of making one's own humanity legible inside it. That kind of labor wears people down. It changes the body. The body keeps score in ordinary ways long before the mind is willing to interpret what it knows. Tightness before a conversation. A stomach that drops at the sound of footsteps. A heart that starts racing when a text comes in. Headaches after family dinners. A sense of dread before car rides, holidays, or bedtime conversations. Women often think they are just stressed. And maybe they are. But stress has a context. The nervous system is not irrational. It is often responding to the fact that there is no stable place for truth to land. And what makes this more painful is that invalidation can happen in the smallest moments. Not only the serious ones. In fact, it is often the small moments that do the most shaping because they are so hard to defend. A woman says she is tired, and her tiredness is immediately compared to his. She says she felt overlooked, and somehow the discussion becomes about how impossible she is to satisfy. She points out something that happened in front of the kids, and she is told she is too sensitive to tone. She tries to revisit a conversation that hurt her, and she is met with an eye roll, a smirk, or the weary implication that this again is why nothing can ever just be peaceful. That phrase matters, this again. Many women in invalidating relationships develop a deep fear of becoming this again. The woman with the concern. The woman with the memory. The woman with the ache that refuses to disappear just because it is inconvenient. So they begin cutting themselves off before the other person has to. They swallow the comment. Drop the subject. Say it is fine. Decide it is not worth the fight. But every time they do that, a little more of their inner life gets taught that peace is purchased through self-erasure. I do not think enough people understand how spiritually expensive that becomes. Because eventually the woman is not only managing the other person's reactions. She is managing her own disappearance. She knows she is leaving parts of herself outside the room, and yet she cannot seem to stop because bringing those parts in has become too punishing. That is where resentment and numbness start living side by side. She still functions. She still gets through the day. But something in her begins to go quiet. Not healed. Not calm. Quiet the way a person goes quiet when she no longer believes that speaking from the center of herself will change anything. I think that is why this kind of harm deserves more seriousness than it is usually given. Not because every invalidating moment equals abuse. Not because every strained marriage should be pathologized. But because repeated emotional dismissal changes people. It changes what they expect from love. It changes what they permit. It changes how they speak, remember, feel, and occupy space. And sometimes the deepest damage is not that someone else failed to see them. It is that they began to lose sight of themselves. That is why I believe keeping a private record of reality can matter so much. Not as evidence for a courtroom, not as ammunition, but as a way of refusing to abandon what I know. What happened? What was said? What I felt in my body? Whether I left the interaction clearer or more confused. Whether the conversation opened reality or narrowed it. A woman in an invalidating relationship often needs somewhere her experience can remain whole, even if it is only on paper for a while. Because the first casualty of chronic invalidation is not always love. Sometimes it is coherence. And once coherence begins to fracture, a woman can spend years believing she has a self-esteem problem when what she really has is a relationship with someone who cannot bear her reality unless it arrives in a form that asks nothing of them. That is not a small thing. That is not a personality clash. That is not just a rough patch. That is the slow and private violence of being trained to distrust the most important witness you have ever had, yourself. When protection becomes performance. There is a moment many women reach after they begin learning the language of emotional harm, and it feels, at first, like empowerment. They discover terms, frameworks, strategies. They hear phrases like gray rock, no contact, boundaries, red flags, trauma bond, nervous system regulation, emotional detachment. Suddenly the chaos has a map. Or at least something that looks like one. And after years of feeling foggy, misread, or emotionally outmaneuvered, that kind of language can feel like armor. It can feel like finally being handed tools after trying to survive with bare hands. I understand the appeal of that stage. In some ways, it is necessary. A woman who has spent too long inside confusion does need words. She does need orientation. She does need concepts that help her stop calling every wound a misunderstanding and every pattern a one-off. But there is a danger hidden inside that relief, and I think it deserves far more attention than it gets. Sometimes protection becomes performance. By that I mean something very specific. A woman begins using the language of self-protection, but not always in the service of truth. Sometimes she uses it in the service of certainty. Sometimes she uses it to avoid the more terrifying work of finding out what is actually true. Sometimes the technique becomes a costume of strength before the deeper clarity has arrived. That is not because she is fake. It is because fear can wear the face of control. Take gray rocking, for example. On the surface, it sounds simple enough: become less emotionally available to the manipulative person. Offer less reaction. Less fuel. Less visible vulnerability. Become harder to provoke, harder to pull into circular conflict, harder to destabilize. In some situations, especially with someone who truly feeds on emotional chaos, that can be protective. It can interrupt the old cycle where every feeling becomes material for further control. It can create distance where direct confrontation only creates more damage. But like many strategies that travel well online, gray rocking starts to sound universal once it becomes popular. And the moment a strategy sounds universal, people stop asking the question that matters most: protective against what, exactly? Because if I use emotional flatness in the wrong relationship, I may not be protecting myself from manipulation. I may be withholding the very information that would reveal whether the other person is capable of meeting me honestly. If every wound gets met with detachment, if every disappointment gets folded into silence, if I stop bringing my real self into the room because I have learned that emotional distance looks strong, then I may feel safer in the moment, but I am also depriving myself of data. And data matters. A relationship is often not revealed by the injury itself. It is revealed by what happens when the injury is named. That is why I think some women become attached to strategies too early. Not because the strategies are wrong, but because uncertainty is unbearable. If I step fully into the truth of a difficult conversation, I might have to discover something I am not ready to know. I might find out that the man I hoped was like Ethan is actually much closer to Daniel. I might find out there is no repair here. Or I might find out that I have been bracing for a depth of harm that is not actually what this relationship is. Either way, I lose the protection of fantasy. And fantasy, even painful fantasy, can feel safer than reality for a while. This is where internet language becomes especially seductive. It gives women methods that appear decisive. Block him. Cut her off. Don't explain. Don't engage. Don't react. Don't feed the dynamic. Be unavailable. Be unbothered. Be impossible to read. Some of that advice may be appropriate in situations of genuine emotional abuse, coercion, or manipulation. But not all distance is wisdom, and not all visible calm is healing. Sometimes a woman is not calm at all. She is frozen. Sometimes she is not detached. She is terrified. Sometimes she is not regulating. She is disappearing in a more sophisticated way. I think that distinction is crucial. There is a form of self-protection that comes from clarity. And there is another form that comes from performance. The first is grounded in reality. The second is often grounded in image, sometimes the image she wants others to see, but more often the image she needs to show herself so she does not have to feel how vulnerable she still is. I think this happens a lot with red flag culture too. There is nothing wrong with noticing warning signs. Mature women should notice them. They should not romanticize every discomfort, override their instincts, or explain away every act of disregard. But there is a difference between discernment and vigilant scoring. When a woman enters love, or even difficult marriage, with the mentality of collecting evidence, she may begin to confuse recognition with understanding. She starts monitoring every behavior as though the point is to catch the person rather than understand the pattern. And the strange thing is, that kind of hypervigilance can actually make real seeing harder. Because when I am scanning for proof, I often reduce everything to events. He did this. He said that. She forgot this. He looked at me that way. He failed to text. He interrupted me. He sighed. He got defensive. And yes, all of those things may matter. But a relationship is rarely revealed through isolated moments alone. It is revealed through atmosphere, repetition, emotional consequence, and what happens when pressure enters the room. That is why I keep coming back to the importance of the real conversation. Not because every relationship should be endlessly processed. Not because every wound deserves a summit meeting. But because without some moments of honest confrontation, I never actually learn what kind of structure I am living inside. What happens if I say, plainly, that hurt me? What happens if I say, I felt dismissed? What happens if I say, this matters to me more than you seem to understand? The answer to those questions tells me more than any social media script ever could. Does the other person become curious, even imperfectly? Do they struggle, but stay in contact with me? Do they show some capacity to hold my experience without instantly making me pay for it? Or do they reverse the emotional burden so quickly that I leave feeling guilty for having spoken? Do they make me sound petty, unstable, dramatic, exhausting, oversensitive, impossible to satisfy? Do they punish the truth by making truth-telling feel unsafe? That is the tiger's cage. The real one. Not the cinematic version. The domestic version. The relational version. The ordinary, adult version where I bring pain to the table and watch whether the room remains human. This, to me, is where false protection often gets exposed. A woman may spend months learning how not to react, how not to explain, how not to cry, how not to hand over too much emotion. But if she never actually tests the relationship with reality, she may stay stuck in a peculiar kind of limbo. Strong on the outside. Unclear on the inside. Performing self-possession while still secretly hoping the relationship is something other than it is. I do not say this harshly. I say it because many women have survived by becoming experts at controlled presentation. They have learned to keep their faces composed, their tone measured, their needs modest, their boundaries polished. But polish is not the same thing as freedom. Sometimes polish is just pain in a more socially acceptable outfit. I also think some women use protection as a way to avoid grief. Because once I stop performing strategy and truly let the data in, I may have to mourn. I may have to mourn the marriage I thought I had. The man I wanted him to be. The years I kept translating what did not want to be translated. The effort I made to become more understandable in a room that was never really open to understanding me. Strategy can delay that grief because it gives me something active to do. Grief asks me to stand still and know something I may not want to know. That is why wise protection is usually quieter than the internet makes it seem. It is not dramatic. It is not branded. It is not built on looking powerful. It is built on contact with reality. It asks, over and over, what helps me see more clearly? What keeps me from abandoning what I know? What lets me gather information without humiliating myself or escalating danger? What kind of response does this relationship consistently produce when I show up honestly? Sometimes the wisest thing is strategic emotional distance. Sometimes it is direct confrontation. Sometimes it is a private journal instead of another argument. Sometimes it is therapy. Sometimes it is saying less. Sometimes it is saying one true thing and watching carefully what comes back. The point is not the technique. The point is whether the technique helps me remain loyal to reality. I think that is the line I trust most now. Not whether something looks strong. Whether it is honest. Not whether it helps me feel in control for 5 minutes. Whether it helps me understand the actual shape of what I am living in. Not whether it performs healing. Whether it protects my capacity to know what is true. Because protection that disconnects me from reality is not protection at all. It is only another form of hiding. And if I have already spent too many years hiding from what a relationship is costing me, the last thing I need is a more sophisticated way to disappear. Chemistry is not safety. I think one of the most heartbreaking mistakes women make is not that they ignore danger. It is that they mistake intensity for safety. Those two things can feel almost indistinguishable in the beginning. Especially to a woman who has spent years being functional, dependable, needed, responsible, and emotionally self-contained. Especially to a woman who has gotten used to being admired for what she does more than cherished for who she is. Especially to a woman who has lived so long in duty that being deeply wanted starts to feel like being deeply known. That is where chemistry becomes dangerous. Not because chemistry itself is bad. I do not believe that. I do not think women should be trained to distrust every surge of attraction, every quickening of the pulse, every feeling of recognition in the presence of another person. We are not machines. We are not meant to live untouched by longing. But longing can become vulnerable when it meets someone who knows how to turn emotional acceleration into false intimacy. And false intimacy is one of the most convincing illusions in adult life. I think by the time many women reach their late 30s, 40s, 50s, or beyond, they are no longer naive about romance in the obvious sense. They know flowers are not character. They know charm is not loyalty. They know being chosen is not the same as being safe. And yet they are still susceptible to a different kind of seduction, the seduction of feeling vividly alive after a long time of feeling emotionally managed, emotionally postponed, or emotionally unseen. That is why chemistry can overpower wisdom for a while. It does not feel childish. It feels like return. Return to the self that still wants. Return to the part of the body that still responds. Return to the hidden hope that somewhere, somehow, there is still a kind of love that arrives with energy, certainty, and a sense of being unmistakably wanted. I understand why that feeling can be irresistible. What concerns me is how often that feeling gets confused with evidence. A woman meets someone and the connection is immediate. He texts in a way that feels attentive. He listens with unusual focus. He remembers details. He says things that seem to reach directly into old places of ache. He notices what previous men missed. He speaks with emotional fluency. He makes her feel singular. Not generic, not interchangeable, not merely attractive in a surface way, but deeply, thrillingly recognized. It can feel less like meeting and more like being found. That experience can be profoundly disarming. And it is especially disarming for women who have spent years in marriages, relationships, or family systems where they were known only in pieces. The useful piece. The stable piece. The accommodating piece. The strong piece. The selfless piece. The one who keeps things moving. So when someone appears and responds not to their function but to their emotional interior, it can feel like oxygen hitting a room that has been shut for years. This is why I do not think love bombing is adequately understood when it is reduced to gifts, over-the-top compliments, or dramatic gestures. Those things may be part of it, but they are not its deepest power. The deepest power is psychological precision. It is the uncanny feeling that someone has located exactly what your hidden self has been starving for and is offering it back to you in a form that feels almost fated. That is what makes it hard to resist. Because a woman is not only responding to the person. She is responding to relief. Relief from ambiguity. Relief from deprivation. Relief from the exhausting experience of always having to wonder where she stands. Relief from emotional drought. There is very little more intoxicating than certainty when you have spent years living in emotional half-light. But certainty is not always care. Sometimes it is acquisition. Sometimes a person does not move quickly because they are sincere. They move quickly because speed keeps you from seeing clearly. The faster the bond forms, the less time there is for pattern to emerge. The less time there is for disappointment to gather enough evidence to become meaningful. The less time there is for the nervous system to notice whether the warmth is stable or strategic. That is why I keep returning to pace. A relationship moving too quickly is not automatically dangerous. Some people do fall in love quickly and build something real. Life is too complicated for rigid rules. But when intensity begins replacing pacing, something important gets threatened. Pacing protects discernment. It creates the emotional space in which a woman can remain in contact with herself while contact with the other person is deepening. Without pacing, the relationship becomes louder than the self. That is usually the first warning sign. I stop hearing my own rhythms. I begin reorganizing my life too fast around the connection. I feel pressure to answer quickly, meet often, reassure constantly, declare feelings before they have had time to settle into truth. The relationship starts demanding emotional centrality before it has earned emotional trust. And because the experience feels so electric, I may not recognize that this is exactly what is happening. I may tell myself I am simply being swept away, when in reality I am being moved away from my own internal timing. I think women often underestimate how protective their separate life is in the beginning of love. Their friends. Their routines. Their private reflections. Their habits. Their Sunday walks. Their long-standing rhythms. Their quiet loyalties to themselves. Those things are not obstacles to romance. They are part of what allows romance to remain grounded in reality rather than fantasy. So one of the most revealing moments in any early or intensifying connection is what happens when I protect that separate life. I say no to one evening because I already have plans. I say I want to slow down. I say I need a little more time. I do not cancel the rest of my existence just because the chemistry is strong. And then I watch. That response tells me so much. A person who is emotionally safe may feel disappointed, but they remain respectful. They do not turn my pace into rejection. They do not punish me for having a full life. They do not make me feel guilty for not rearranging everything to match the urgency of their desire. They may want closeness, but they do not use emotional pressure to force intimacy into happening before trust has taken shape. An unsafe person often cannot tolerate that kind of ordinary boundary. Suddenly my independence becomes evidence that I am not really invested. My existing life becomes a threat. My desire for slowness gets recast as fear, mixed signals, lack of commitment, or cruelty. The connection becomes conditional on my willingness to feed its speed. And because the chemistry is real, I may be tempted to override my own instincts in order to keep the intensity alive. This is how women begin abandoning themselves in relationships that still feel exciting. Not through obvious coercion at first. Through emotional acceleration. Through the subtle manipulation of pace. Through the implication that if I truly felt what he feels, I would move faster, answer sooner, merge more completely, reveal more, surrender more, prioritize him more. And in some cases, the woman does not even realize she is being trained. She only notices later that she stopped checking in with herself. That she lost touch with her own natural caution. That she began measuring the relationship by how vivid it felt instead of by how safe it was to be fully human inside it. I think that distinction is especially important for women who have histories of emotional deprivation, invalidation, or attachment wounds. When someone comes in with extraordinary focus, extraordinary admiration, extraordinary emotional intensity, those old wounds can interpret the experience as healing. And for a little while, it may feel like healing. But not everything that soothes a wound is medicine. Some things merely stimulate the part of us that has been waiting too long to be chosen. That is why chemistry can be so deceptive. It does not ask whether the person is safe. It asks whether the person is activating. Whether they are responsive. Whether they are compelling. Whether they make us feel. And feeling deeply is not meaningless. But it is not the same thing as being protected in intimacy. Safety reveals itself differently. Safety is often less theatrical, less intoxicating, less consuming in the beginning. It listens, but it does not invade. It wants closeness, but it can tolerate space. It is attentive without becoming possessive. It can hold desire without turning desire into urgency. It respects the pace at which trust actually grows, which is rarely as fast as chemistry wants it to. Safety also shows itself in frustration, in delay, in the ordinary inconveniences of human life. How does this person respond when plans change, when I disappoint them, when I do not say exactly what they hoped, when I remain my own person instead of becoming their emotional proof? Those moments often reveal far more than attraction ever can. Because chemistry says, I want you. Safety says, you are allowed to remain yourself while I want you. That is the line I trust now. Not whether the connection feels strong, but whether the strength of it asks me to betray my own timing. Not whether I feel desired, but whether I feel increasingly free to stay in honest contact with myself. Not whether the relationship feels fated, but whether it allows reality to unfold without pressure turning every pause into danger. I do not think women need less longing. I think they need a more careful relationship to the emotional force of longing. A willingness to let desire be real without letting it become evidence. A willingness to enjoy the spark without assigning it the moral authority of safety. A willingness to say, this feels alive, but I still need to learn what kind of life it is. Because the most painful truth is not that chemistry can mislead us. It is that chemistry often feels most convincing precisely when we need comfort most. And that is why mature love is not built only on being moved. It is built on being able to remain intact while I am moved. Why so many strong women stay? People love to ask why women stay as if the answer should be simple. They ask it with a kind of confidence that tells me they have never had to live inside the slow mathematics of attachment. They ask it as though relationships can be solved like logic problems, as though pain automatically cancels love, as though intelligence should override hope, as though a woman who sees what is happening should naturally walk toward the exit and never look back. Underneath the question, there is often a private judgment: if she stayed, surely something in her must have been weak. I do not believe that. In fact, I think many women stay because they are strong in ways the world has taught them to be proud of. They stay because they know how to endure. Because they know how to carry complexity without collapsing. Because they know how to keep a house moving, a family functioning, a career intact, a child protected, a dinner served, a crisis contained. They know how to absorb pressure and keep going. They know how to survive seasons that would flatten other people. They know how to be dependable long after they should have been allowed to fall apart. And that is exactly why harmful relationships can hold them for so long. A strong woman is not always easy to break in obvious ways. So the relationship learns to use her strengths against her. Her patience becomes permission. Her loyalty becomes a leash. Her empathy becomes a tool through which she explains away what should have been named sooner. Her capacity to stay calm becomes the very thing that keeps the system intact. The world sees her composure and calls it resilience. Sometimes it is resilience. But sometimes it is simply what survival has looked like for so long that no one recognizes the cost anymore. I think one of the deepest misunderstandings about painful relationships is the assumption that people stay because the relationship is consistently terrible. That is not usually how these things work. If pain came without interruption, many women would leave sooner. What keeps people attached is not only the hurt. It is the rhythm. The alternation. The good days that break open just enough relief to make the bad days feel survivable. The tenderness that returns before despair can fully harden into decision. The apology that comes just as she is reaching the edge. The softness after the storm that makes her wonder whether she imagined the storm at all. That pattern is not trivial. It is one of the most psychologically powerful systems human beings can get caught in. When pain and relief are woven together, the nervous system does not settle. It chases. It waits. It bargains. It learns to orient around the possibility of restoration. That is why women so often say, "But when it was good, it was really good." They are not lying. They are describing the trap. The good is not incidental. It is part of what binds. It makes the relationship emotionally sticky. It fills the woman with just enough hope to keep investing in what hurts her. Hope can be beautiful. It can also be brutal. Because in these relationships, hope rarely feels abstract. It feels practical. Maybe if I say it better. Maybe if I do not bring it up when he is tired. Maybe if this stressful season ends. Maybe if the kids get older. Maybe if we go to therapy. Maybe if I stop reacting so much. Maybe if I become calmer, clearer, softer, less needy, more direct, more forgiving, less intense, more understanding. Hope often disguises itself as effort. And strong women are especially vulnerable to that disguise because they are accustomed to effort paying off elsewhere in life. In work, effort often leads to competence. In parenting, effort can build stability. In friendship, effort can deepen trust. In healthy love, effort can support repair. So it is not irrational for a woman to believe that effort might save the relationship. It is not foolish for her to think that if she can just understand the pattern better, communicate more wisely, manage her nervous system more carefully, or soften the sharp edges of conflict, she might finally arrive at the version of the relationship that has been almost visible for years. That is one of the cruelest emotional economies in these dynamics. The woman keeps being rewarded just enough to continue investing in a system that rarely gives back what it promises. And then there is fawning, which I think explains far more than most people are willing to admit. Fawning is not the same thing as being kind. It is not the same thing as being generous or emotionally intelligent. It is a survival strategy. A deeply learned reflex in which safety becomes linked to pleasing, smoothing, anticipating, accommodating, and regulating the emotional weather around someone else. Many women learn this long before they ever met the partner who would later intensify it. They learned it in childhood homes where moods ruled the atmosphere. Where love was unpredictable. Where one parent's distress or anger or fragility shaped the emotional climate of the whole household. In those environments, a girl often becomes highly perceptive. She learns to read tone instantly. She learns to prevent rupture before it happens. She learns that self-expression is risky, but attunement to others is rewarded. That child grows up. She becomes capable, thoughtful, deeply tuned to the emotional states of others. The world praises her for being mature. Relationships praise her for being understanding. She may not even know that the tenderness others admire in her is braided with old fear. Then one day she finds herself with someone whose moods, needs, ego, or instability require constant adjustment, and suddenly the old choreography returns. Not consciously. Bodily. She smooths. She soothes. She explains. She minimizes. She absorbs. She helps him come back to himself again and again, not realizing that she has quietly stepped out of herself to do it. That is not weakness. It is adaptation so old and so skillful that it feels like identity. I think women between 35 and 60 are especially vulnerable to staying for reasons the culture refuses to honor properly. By this stage in life, love is rarely just love. It is entangled with mortgages, children, stepchildren, aging parents, shared history, health insurance, social identity, friend groups, business ties, geographic roots, and the deep fatigue that comes from having already built one life and not knowing whether you have the strength to build another. A woman may not only be asking herself whether the relationship is hurting her. She may be asking what leaving will cost her daughter, her son, her retirement, her mother, her home, her standing in the community, the shape of the holidays, the narrative of the family, the years she has already poured into making this work. People who ask, "Why did she stay?" as if it were a clean question have no idea how crowded the answer usually is. And then there is the most private answer of all. Sometimes a woman stays because she does not yet know who she is without the labor of staying. That may be the hardest truth in this whole conversation. Some women have spent so many years organizing around a partner's moods, needs, expectations, chaos, brilliance, fragility, entitlement, or avoidance that the relationship becomes not only a bond but a structure of self. She becomes the one who knows how to prevent the blow-up, interpret the silence, absorb the contempt, keep the children steady, rescue the evening, redirect the tension, get through the trip, save the holiday, manage the story. If that structure disappears, what remains? Not in theory. In the body. In the house. In the morning. In the hour before dinner. In the quiet. Who is she when she is no longer orienting around him? That question can hold a woman longer than people understand. I think of what I privately call the hallway version of a woman. The version of her that comes alive the second she hears the key in the door or the garage opening. Her body shifts before her mind has even formed a thought. She listens for the footsteps. She reads the air. She feels for the mood before she chooses her next sentence. Maybe nothing terrible happens. Maybe most evenings are ordinary. But the body has already learned that another person's entrance changes the emotional rules of the house. Women can live years in that hallway state and still call themselves fine. That is why leaving is not only logistical. It is physiological. The nervous system has to believe that another life is survivable. And if the relationship has become the organizing principle of daily existence, even a painful one, then departure can feel less like freedom and more like free fall. So when I think about why strong women stay, I do not think first about denial. I think about attachment, pattern, history, adaptation, exhaustion, and the terrible persistence of hope. I think about how many women have been trained to make a virtue of staying calm in rooms where calm is repeatedly used against them. I think about the ones who keep loving not because they are naive, but because their whole life has taught them that endurance is what love looks like. I think about how often women are praised for being the stable one, while privately disappearing under the weight of that role. And I think about the shame that gets added afterward. The shame of having stayed. The shame of having known and not acted. The shame of telling the story and hearing other people flatten it into a single decision, as if years of emotional complexity could be reduced to one missed exit sign. That shame is so unnecessary. It turns survival into guilt. It makes women apologize for the very adaptations that once kept them going. I do not think the better question is why she stayed. I think the better question is what she had been carrying that made staying feel more possible than leaving. Sometimes the answer is love. Sometimes fear. Sometimes trauma. Sometimes money. Sometimes children. Sometimes religion. Sometimes exhaustion. Sometimes an old wound still trying to heal itself through the wrong person. Sometimes all of it at once. And sometimes the first real movement toward healing is not leaving. Sometimes it is simply the moment a strong woman stops using all of her strength to stabilize the relationship and begins, quietly, to use some of that strength to stay on the side of her own truth. Healing that does not humiliate you. There is a version of healing that I no longer trust. It is glossy, efficient, and strangely disrespectful to pain. It asks women to recover in a way that makes other people comfortable. It wants transformation without grief, wisdom without disorientation, boundaries without trembling, detachment without heartbreak. It tells women to rise, glow, reclaim, reinvent, move on, close the chapter, become unrecognizable, become powerful, become untouchable. And every time I hear that language used too quickly, something in me recoils. Because I do not think healing should humiliate the person who was hurt. I do not think healing should demand performance from a woman whose inner life has already been bent too many times around other people's needs, moods, and interpretations. I do not think she should have to become impressive in order to become whole. I do not think she should have to narrate her recovery like a triumph story while her body is still trying to understand what safety even feels like. And I do not think she should be pressured to call something beautiful before she has even had the chance to admit that it nearly erased her. Real healing is not pretty at first. It is often quiet, inconvenient, uneven. It does not arrive as clarity all at once. It arrives in fragments. A sentence that finally lands. A memory that stops distorting itself to protect someone else. A morning when the body feels slightly less braced. A moment in the kitchen when I realize I am no longer rehearsing what I would say if I had to defend my feelings. Healing, in its truest form, does not begin with reinvention. It begins with contact. Contact with what was real. Contact with what it cost. Contact with the self that had to go quiet in order to endure. I think that is why being believed matters so much. Not praised. Not coached. Not rushed toward empowerment. Believed. Sometimes that belief comes from another person. A therapist, a friend, a sister, a support group, a person who listens without trying to improve the story into something easier to digest. But sometimes, and this is especially powerful, belief begins inside the woman herself. She stops editing. Stops softening. Stops giving the other person the final authority over the meaning of her own experience. She writes down what happened and does not immediately add a paragraph explaining why maybe it was not that bad. She notices what her body does in certain rooms, after certain calls, on certain mornings. She begins, slowly, to treat her own perception not as a problem to solve, but as a witness worth listening to. That shift is sacred. Because so much damage in these relationships does not come only from what happened. It comes from the fact that the woman was taught not to trust what happened. She was trained to negotiate against herself. To downgrade her own knowing. To explain away what her nervous system had already registered. So healing often begins not with confidence in the glamorous sense, but with something smaller and more dignified. I believe that I felt what I felt. I believe that it mattered. I believe that what kept confusing me was confusing for a reason. From there, the body has to be invited back into the process. I do not think enough people understand how physical relational harm can become, even when no one has touched you in the overt sense. A woman can spend years in a destabilizing relationship and come out with symptoms that look unrelated until she begins tracing them back. The headaches. The stomach pain. The insomnia. The jaw tension. The fatigue that feels older than her age. The strange dread before ordinary events. The startle response when a phone lights up. The inability to fully rest, even in a quiet room, because some part of her still expects an emotional weather change she will have to manage. The body does not care whether other people would call the relationship bad enough. The body cares whether it had to live in uncertainty, vigilance, suppression, and emotional contradiction for too long. That is why healing cannot be only cognitive. I cannot think my way back into safety if my body still believes love is where I disappear. So part of healing is not just insight. It is retraining. Not in a harsh or performative way. In a patient one. It may look like therapy. It may look like walking without my phone. It may look like sitting by a window in the morning before anyone asks anything of me, allowing my body to feel a few moments of unclaimed existence. It may look like noticing when my shoulders rise, when my breath shortens, when my stomach knots, and asking what truth my body is holding before my mind has fully caught up. It may look like tears that arrive late. Anger that arrives later. Numbness that I stop shaming because numbness, too, is often how the body survives what it cannot safely process in real time. I also think healing asks a woman to rebuild preference, and I do not think that task is small. In many painful relationships, especially the ones structured around one person's moods, ego, or emotional gravity, the other person's preferences slowly become the climate. What restaurant is easiest? What topic is safest? What tone keeps the evening intact? What plans avoid friction? What version of the truth costs the least? Over time, a woman may lose contact with something as simple and as holy as what she likes. Not because she became shallow, but because self-suppression became so normal that desire itself went dim. So healing often begins in surprisingly ordinary places. I ask myself what I want for dinner and answer honestly. I choose the chair I like, not the one that makes everyone else comfortable. I play music that fits my actual mood instead of curating the room around someone else's state. I take a longer route home because I need a few more minutes alone. I buy the flowers for myself. I make the cake that once felt forbidden because somebody else hated the smell. I order the olives. I relearn my own tastes not because preference is everything, but because it is one of the first territories colonized by relational imbalance. And reclaiming it is a way of telling the self, you are allowed to exist in specifics again. I think community matters here too, though not in the loud way people sometimes imagine. Not everyone needs a giant circle. Not every woman wants to tell her whole story in public. But almost nobody heals well in total isolation. Painful relationships make women private in dangerous ways. They teach them to doubt what others will understand. They teach them to hide the most destabilizing parts because those parts are hard to explain without sounding confused, and confusion is often mistaken for unreliability. So one of the most healing things that can happen is not advice. It is being in the presence of someone who does not rush, does not correct, does not dramatize, and does not look away. Someone who can hold the complexity without turning it into a slogan. That kind of witness is medicine. And then there is forgiveness, which I think has been mishandled in ways that have burdened women unnecessarily for generations. I do not believe forgiveness is a requirement for healing. I think it can happen for some women in some circumstances, in some honest and deeply personal form. But I do not trust any healing model that treats forgiveness like a moral checkpoint a woman must pass in order to prove she is spiritually mature. Too often, that demand simply repeats the old injury in a more respectable language. It asks her, once again, to make someone else's comfort more important than the truth of her own pain. I do not need to sanctify what hurt me in order to be free of it. I do not need to call something understandable, redeemable, or secretly beneficial if what I am still carrying is grief. I do not need to erase my anger before its wisdom has fully spoken. I do not need to become gracious toward the person who diminished me if that grace requires me to betray the part of myself that finally told the truth. What I need is release without self-abandonment. That, to me, is a more honorable goal. Not forgiveness on command. Not revenge either. Just the slow decentering of the person who once occupied too much psychic space. The relationship stops being the sun around which all my thoughts revolve. Their mood is no longer the weather report I check before entering my own day. Their view of me becomes less authoritative. Their version of the story loses oxygen. Not because I force myself into indifference, but because I have begun building a life in which my interior world no longer depends on their interpretation. Healing, then, is not an ascent. It is an excavation. Underneath the adaptation, the politeness, the fear, the over-explaining, the hypervigilance, the self-doubt, the endless emotional labor, there is still a self. Not untouched. Not innocent in some childlike way. But still there. Still carrying certain loves. Certain instincts. Certain capacities that were never destroyed, only buried under survival. And maybe the gentlest, most radical thing I can say about healing is this: I do not have to become harder in order to become whole. I do not have to become dazzling. I do not have to become invulnerable. I do not have to prove that I have transcended my pain. I only have to become more faithful to what is true, more tender toward what is wounded, and more unwilling to hand my inner life back to anything that requires my diminishment in order to survive. That is healing I can respect. The kind that does not humiliate me. The kind that does not rush me. The kind that lets me come back to myself with dignity. Reclaiming the word, reclaiming ourselves. I think the final temptation in any conversation like this is to end with certainty. To gather everything into a clean conclusion. To point to the people who hurt us, point to the word that explains them, and feel the relief of finally having the right label in hand. There is something deeply human about wanting that ending. After confusion, certainty feels like justice. After years of emotional distortion, a sharp definition can feel almost holy. It can feel like I have finally taken back what was taken from me. But I do not think reclaiming this conversation begins with becoming more certain about other people. I think it begins with becoming more honest about what words are supposed to do. A word is supposed to illuminate. It is supposed to help me see more clearly, not make me stop looking. It is supposed to give shape to reality, not replace reality with a more emotionally satisfying story. And that is where I think this conversation has become so fragile. The word narcissism has become powerful enough to help many people tell the truth, but also popular enough to tempt many people away from truth. It has become a word that can clarify or distort, protect or inflame, depending on whether I use it as a lens or as a weapon. That difference matters to me more than ever. Because once a word becomes culturally charged, people begin using it to do emotional work it was never meant to do. They use it to end conversations instead of deepen them. They use it to collapse complexity into accusation. They use it as proof that their pain counts, when the pain already counted before the label arrived. They use it to recruit other people into taking sides. They use it to avoid the more intimate and difficult task of describing what actually happened inside the relationship. And yet I do not want to lose the word entirely, because I do not think losing language protects women. I think losing language often sends them back into confusion. So reclaiming the word, for me, does not mean throwing it away. It means restoring its weight. It means refusing to use it casually just because the culture has normalized casual use. It means resisting the thrill of diagnosis when what is needed is discernment. It means being mature enough to say, this relationship is harming me, before I rush to define the exact psychological architecture of the person harming me. It means allowing my own experience to matter even before I have produced a perfect conceptual explanation for it. I think that last part is especially important for women. Because women are so often taught that their pain only counts if they can justify it in a way the world finds legible. If there is no affair, no bruise, no addiction, no headline-level event, then somehow the suffering becomes harder to defend. Women begin collecting language not only for understanding, but for permission. Permission to say this is real. Permission to say this has changed me. Permission to say I have been lonely in a relationship other people admire. Permission to say I have been diminished in ways no one can photograph. That is why I believe reclaiming the word is inseparable from reclaiming ourselves. If I use narcissism only as a way to diagnose the other person, I may still remain trapped inside their gravity. The relationship is still centered around them. Their structure, their pattern, their psychology, their motives, their pathology, their inability to love well, their defenses, their wounds. All of that may be real, but if my whole recovery still orbits the other person, then something of the old system remains in place. I have more language now, perhaps, but I may still be living in relation to them as the central fact. At some point, I have to ask a different question. Not only who they were. Who did I have to become in order to survive them? That question changes everything. Because then the conversation is no longer just about identifying harm. It becomes about understanding the adaptations that harm created inside me. The self-doubt. The over-explaining. The vigilance. The tendency to brace before speaking. The urge to soften my truth before it reaches the room. The reflex to make other people comfortable before I ask whether I myself am safe. The strange guilt that appears the moment I become clear. The way I learn to confuse endurance with love, politeness with peace, silence with maturity. When I begin to see that, the word narcissism moves back into its rightful place. It becomes a tool for recognition, not a throne from which I judge the world. It helps me understand the system I lived in, but it does not become the whole story of my inner life. I think we desperately need that shift culturally too. We are living in a time that rewards emotional theater. People perform knowledge online with enormous confidence and very little humility. Nuance is treated as weakness. Ambivalence is treated as confusion. Precision is less exciting than outrage. In that atmosphere, words like narcissism get inflated beyond usefulness. They become the psychological equivalent of shouting. And once that happens, the people most in need of clarity are often the ones least protected by the noise. I want something steadier than noise. I want a culture more interested in pattern than performance. More interested in emotional consequence than public image. More interested in psychological safety than romantic mythology. More interested in how a relationship feels in the body over time than how respectable it looks from the outside. I want us to stop mistaking social polish for moral depth. I want us to stop assuming that obvious chaos is the only form danger takes. I want us to become more fluent in the quieter injuries, chronic invalidation, emotional reversal, contempt disguised as superiority, confusion that accumulates until a woman no longer knows how to occupy her own mind without argument. And I want women, especially women who have spent decades being the stable ones, to stop waiting for a level of devastation dramatic enough to earn permission. That may be the hardest part. So many women keep asking themselves the wrong question. Is this bad enough to count? Is this serious enough to justify my distress? Has enough happened yet for me to trust what I feel? Those questions keep women trapped because they are built around thresholds the outside world recognizes, not thresholds the soul recognizes. A more honest question is this: what has this been costing me? What has it cost me to keep explaining the same hurt? What has it cost me to stay in rooms where my reality keeps getting reduced? What has it cost me to be loyal to people who require my self-abandonment? What has it cost me to keep translating pain into forms that offend no one? What has it cost my body to live like this? What has it cost my sense of self to keep negotiating with what I know? That is where the real reckoning begins. And I think that reckoning is deeply dignified. Not dramatic. Not self-righteous. Not vindictive. Just clear. There is a kind of adult sorrow in it, and a kind of adult honesty too. By the time many women reach this point, they are not looking for heroes and villains anymore. They are looking for truth that can hold. Truth they can build a life on. Truth that does not force them to betray complexity, but also does not ask them to keep romanticizing what is wounding them. That is the ending I believe in. Not the ending where every harmful person is perfectly categorized. Not the ending where every woman becomes fearless. Not the ending where all pain turns into gratitude and all damage turns into wisdom on schedule. I believe in a quieter ending than that. The kind where a woman begins to trust her own inner life again. The kind where she no longer needs the world to agree before she lets her experience matter. The kind where she stops confusing emotional erosion with intimacy. The kind where she can finally say, without performance and without apology, this did not feel safe for me, and that truth is enough to begin. If I can reclaim the word at all, I want to reclaim it in service of that kind of honesty. Not so I can call more people narcissists. So I can stop calling my own diminishment love. So I can stop mistaking confusion for loyalty. So I can stop waiting for obvious wreckage before I trust quiet devastation. So I can make language serve reality again. And maybe that is what reclaiming ourselves really is. Not becoming harder. Not becoming louder. Not becoming above it all. Just becoming unwilling, at last, to abandon what I know when it matters most. At the heart of this story is not just a woman who was hurt. It is a woman who slowly lost the ability to trust what she felt while still appearing perfectly functional to the outside world. That is what makes her story so powerful. She was not falling apart in obvious ways. She was still showing up, still managing life, still doing what women so often do, holding everything together while something inside them quietly unraveled. Along the way, she met different kinds of men, different kinds of pain, and different kinds of confusion. One kind of man, like Ethan, could fail badly and still face what he had done with remorse and accountability. Another kind, like Daniel, could look respectable, stable, even admirable, while steadily making her feel smaller, less certain, and less real. That contrast became the turning point of her awakening. She began to understand that not all pain in relationships means the same thing, and not all damage looks dramatic. Some wounds come like fire. Others come like fog. And fog can be harder to survive because it does not just hurt you, it makes you question whether you are even seeing clearly. As her story unfolded, the real struggle was not simply figuring out whether someone was a narcissist. The deeper struggle was learning how to name what was happening without abandoning herself again. She had to learn that chemistry is not the same as safety, that intensity is not the same as intimacy, and that a relationship can look fine on the outside while quietly starving a person on the inside. She had to face how easy it is for strong women to stay in painful dynamics, not because they are weak, but because they are loyal, adaptive, hopeful, and deeply trained to endure. And perhaps most importantly, she had to learn that healing is not about becoming harder, shinier, or more impressive. It is about becoming more honest. More faithful to what she knows. More willing to stop translating her pain into language that makes everyone else comfortable. The deepest lesson from her story is this: the most dangerous thing is not always the person who hurts you. Sometimes it is the moment you start distrusting your own reality in order to keep the relationship alive. That is where so many women begin to disappear. And that is why the lesson is not simply leave or fight or label people correctly. The lesson is to protect your inner truth before it gets negotiated away. In real life, that may look like noticing how your body feels after certain conversations. It may mean paying attention to whether honesty brings connection or punishment. It may mean asking yourself not, is this bad enough to count, but, what has this been costing my peace, my body, my identity, my spirit? That is a more mature question. And often, it is the question that opens the door to real clarity. Disclaimer: this video is for educational and reflective purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional diagnosis, therapy, or mental health treatment from a licensed psychologist or qualified clinician. Now I want to ask you a quick question. If a relationship leaves you constantly confused, anxious, and unsure of your own feelings, which matters more? A. Whether the person looks good on paper. B. Whether you feel emotionally safe in reality. Comment A or B below. And I'd really love to hear your perspective too. What part of this story hit you the hardest? What do you think people most often misunderstand about painful relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your experience too. And if this kind of deep, honest conversation speaks to you, subscribe to the channel to support it and help keep these meaningful videos coming.